Good afternoon, everyone. It looks like we still have a number of you filing into the webinar. Thank you for joining us today for this important and timely webinar on ensuring accuracy in test audits. I'm Joe Petrucci. I'm the Communications and Marketing Manager for the Pennsylvania Compensation Rating Bureau. And on behalf of everyone at PCRB and DCRB, we're grateful for your time and your participation today. We hope today's webinar delivers valuable information and helpful insights so that your test audit process can be smooth. I think we'll give another maybe 60 seconds or so just to let a few more folks file into the webinar room, but we will get started in just a few seconds. So thank you again for being here. Okay, I think we're at a good number now with over 200 of you here today. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll turn it over to our very own Christina Yost.
Hi, thanks, Joe. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. We really appreciated the response to this webinar, and I really hope you all get something out of the presentation. Just as a quick reminder, today's presentation is not intended to discuss a specific difference or a specific file, and we're not here to discuss specific carriers. But this is just to give you some insight into the test audit program. As you can see, we are recording today's presentation, and our intention is to create a test audit bulletin with some of the highlights that we'll post in the coming weeks. Quick background, the test audit program is a quality program. Carriers' data and information is sent to us, and it's essentially used for rate-making purposes. So the test audit program is created to make sure that the information we're getting is accurate and is following Bureau manual rules. Our staff is not provided with your audit prior to them conducting their audit. And in some cases, our audit may be done before you're even notified of the test audit selection. The intention is that when you get the selection, you're just going to pull the audit and send it over to us because we want it to be an accurate representation of your normal and daily workflow. That way, if we do find problems, we all can discuss it and find ways to make it better. Recently, we have discussed some areas that can use an explanation or maybe a refresher, and that is the reason for today's webinar. I'm going to be turning it over to Roxanne Trison in just a minute. She will be handling our presentation today. Given the number of people that we have, we will be monitoring the chat for questions, but we are going to hold questions until the very end. So if you have something, throw it in the chat, and then we'll be sure to address it at the very end. That's all it for me. I'm going to turn it over to Roxanne now.
I just want to make sure everybody can hear me and see my screen. Sure, Christina will tell me if I'm not, okay?
I can.
So just a couple things that we're going to touch base on today. I do have our agenda up. One of the things that we'll touch on is the rescind process. We'll also go over some of the things that we're noticing, an increase in the number of differences being cited, some generals about the difference response process, and at the end, like Christina said,
there are a couple of people who are saying they can't see anything.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll take a look at that. Yeah, I'll take
Okay,
a look at
thank
that
you.
right away, Christina, and make sure
Okay.
we get that fixed.
So you can proceed, Roxanne. Sorry, I just wanted to address that immediately.
And once we get to the end, we'll go through some question and answers, some of the questions that you submitted. We also have some questions that we came up with just in case there happen to not be questions. And we'll go over some of the resources that we have available to help you out. So just to get started, some of you may be aware that the test audit program does allow for you to request a selection be rescinded if the carrier wasn't able to complete their audit. One of the things to remember about this process is that if you do not request a rescind of the selection, we will not consider it for rescission. You actually have to make the request. That has to be made at the initial submission of your information in those first 10 business days when we ask for your worksheets and final billing. Back in 2015, we made a change to the Test Audit Online portal where we have a request form for you to submit your request for rescission when there's 3 attempts being made. That form kind of helped us facilitate the process. It streamlines, it lets us know that you're requesting a rescind, and it gives us the documentation that we need to review. When a carrier makes 3 attempts, those attempts can be made in person, they can be made by mail, they can be made by phone or by email. When you submit the form, you're going to give us copies of that documentation. If it's phone call or email, usually we get a progress report showing that the phone calls or emails were made. If you sent letters in the mail, give us a copy of those letters that you sent in the mail. If you send an email, if you have a copy of the email, that is very helpful because we do review that information. We review the dates of your attempts, we review who you're contacting, just to make sure that the attempts are legitimate, that they're on 3 separate dates, and that you're essentially complying with our program. Again, back to the 3 separate dates, I just want to touch on that. If you make 2 attempts on one date, we count it as 1 attempt. So if you call the employer and then call the agent on the same day, in our eyes, we view that as 1 attempt, not 2. You would have to make separate calls on separate days for those to be counted as additional attempts. A newer type of rescind that we allow in the test audit program is if a carrier applies the audit noncompliance charge. The audit noncompliance charge is an endorsement that's attached to the policy. It allows a carrier to charge up to 2 times the estimated policy premium if an employer does not cooperate with their audit attempts. This endorsement has to be attached to the policy at inception. It can't be added afterwards. And we do verify when the submission is made that the endorsement is on the policy. So what you would do for this type of rescind is you would use the ANC rescind form. You would provide documentation of your attempts made to the employer, and you would submit that information along with your billing showing that you attach that audit noncompliance, which is code 9757 here in Pennsylvania and Delaware. And what we do when we review that information, we review the appointment letters and we make sure that those appointment letters tell the employer, number one, that you're going to apply the ANC if they don't cooperate. And number 2, the information that they need to provide to complete the audit. That does have to be specified. You can't just tell them you're trying to make an appointment. You do have to say these are the records that are needed and the ANC will be applied. In cases where that information is not in the letter, we have denied those requests. So if you're only making 2 requests and you're applying the ANC, you want to make sure that you have that information in your appointment letters. And if the criteria is not met, we do deny the request and we proceed with the test audit. Another reason that the carrier might have to request a rescind is if the policy was canceled either midterm or at inception. If you happen to get a test audit request for a policy that you believe to have been canceled, that signals to us that the policy was not canceled through the bureau channels electronically, or the process wasn't completed all the way. In those cases, what you want to do is go back through the policy system, make sure that the cancellation is submitted. That's done by electronic reporting or through our PDM system. And once that's done, you can request that we rescind the selection. We can't rescind it if you didn't cancel the policy. So if you write in and tell us you canceled that policy at inception, we're going to go and check to make sure it was canceled. If it's not, we're going to come back to you. So it would just cut out a step if you did that process before asking us to rescind the selection. And that if you are getting a lot of those requests, it's a good idea to maybe talk to your policy people just to make sure that they understand the process and that they're making the cancellations properly. Okay, moving forward into the number of differences that we've been seeing, we have over the past few years seen a steady increase in the number of differences that we're identifying. This has started to stack up a little bit more since COVID and a big switch over to pretty much everyone doing a hybrid or a remote audit. The areas that we're seeing the most differences at this point are construction classifications, store classifications, and especially cashiers, clerical office employees, We're seeing a big number of differences in the owner and officer inclusion and exclusion areas, and also in the just general payroll and verification of the audits. So we'll dive in a little bit to these. We'll talk about what we are seeing and also what we think can be done to help with the situation. With construction classifications, the one thing that you want to keep in mind is that these classifications are assigned based on the trade being performed. They're not incidental to another type of job. A construction class being incident to another construction class isn't a concept that we have. We separately rate everything based on the type of job and the location. And we do require that separate payroll records are maintained. And when you're breaking down that payroll, you can't use estimates or percentages. If there aren't separate payroll records being maintained for each type of work, the highest rated class is assigned for all interchanging employees. And that's even if it's a small percentage of their work or just a small percentage of the employer's overall operations. We often get responses back from carriers where they will say that, well, this type of work was incident to that, or this was incidental to that. And we always go back and we reference these manual rules. So we just want to reemphasize these rules. And these are all rules that come from the manual. One of the areas where this separate class for each type of trade gets misclassified the most is with commercial construction work. These are apartment buildings or businesses or office buildings, large buildings. With carpentry for commercial work, the code that we use is 651. That classification includes things like framing and siding, but most of the other trades are separately classified, even if the crew is interchanging at one job site because of how the manual wording is. So trades like wiring, plumbing, and painting, those are all separately classified or separately rated, even if the employee was also doing framing at that job site. If they were interchanging and there aren't separate payroll records, all of the payroll is going to go to the highest rated classification. That is different than how we handle a residential construction, because for residential construction, the code 652 is a project class where when employees are interchanging, they all go to that classification. So that is a difference that you do need to be cognizant of, and you should be watching the kinds of work that are being done at the job sites to classify it based on what's being performed. Another area where we tend to see this misapplied, the rule with separate trades, is with HVAC work, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. We classify forced air work differently than we classify water and steam-based heating work. The water and steam-based heating work goes to code 663, which is our plumbing classification, and 664 is our heating, ventilation, and air conditioning work, which is used for the forced air work. The rating values between these classes tend to flip-flop every year, so it's very important to be mindful of whether there are separate payroll records, and if there aren't separate payroll records, which classification is the highest during that policy period. And this is true even if the employer does 1 or 2% of their work in that hot water heating area and the rest is forced air. If 663 is higher rated and there aren't separate records, that 663 is the class that should be used. You should also be making sure if an employer is doing both kinds of work, that both 663 and 664 are authorized. If they're not authorized, you're going to want to write in and ask us to take a look to add the class that isn't authorized and applicable. There are also times where the scope of a classification changes or the manual wording within a classification changes. When those changes happen, we do announce those changes in our filings. We also announce them in our bureau circulars, and it is also published in our manual once it goes into effect. An area where we have seen an uptick in these differences being cited due to changes in the manual wording or rules, particularly with fencing. This changed back in 2019 in Pennsylvania, effective 4/1/19, as announced in Bureau Circular 1711. Fence erection and installation was reassigned to code 651 for metal work. So metal fence installation used to go to 658. Now it's in 651, and 651 wording says all fence erection, whether it's metal, vinyl, or wood. And it also applies whether it's commercial or residential. It all goes to 651. Being cognizant of these changes and when they go to effect can help you mitigate differences, because if you recognize that the class wasn't appropriate, you could write in and ask us for a class change. Another area where we did have a change with manual scope was with door installation. This was way back in 2012, 4/1/2012. It was announced in Bureau Circular 1592. Door installation for interiors, specifically metal doors. These are assigned to code 651. They used to be assigned to code 658. The exception with that is overhead doors. They continue to go to 675. And when you're thinking an overhead door, think of the garage type of door that you would see like in an automobile facility where that pulls up over your head. The other doors inside of a building, those go to code 651. Another scope that changed, and this is a little bit more recently, this was 4/1/2020. People may have missed it because it was during COVID and there were a lot of other things going on. However, the scope of code 676 has changed and now allows for shop work to be separately rated. So that means if you have employees that are working in a fabrication shop fabricating sheet metal products, their payroll can be separately rated to code 454. This is different because before it used to all go to code 676. So that is just a change that you do want to be mindful of. And if you do notice that you're working with a 676 employer and they do have a shop, that you want to ask us to authorize that shop classification for them. Okay, diving into the store classifications and cashiers. Again, with stores, you want to be mindful of how the store is operating. One of the things that I don't want to keep bringing up COVID, but COVID did change the way some things operate. Some of those things are stores. So we do want to look at maybe a store changed the way they've operated now as opposed to the way they operated 5 years ago. Um, we want to know how they sell things, who are they selling it to, how are the payments being made. So those are the kind of questions, anytime you're looking at a store, you want to make sure that your description addresses those. The other thing you want to look at is what does the employer sell, because sometimes what they sell dictates the classification. How they sell it. Are they selling it on the internet? Are they selling it in a little store? Do they sell by combination? Is it more by internet? Those are things you want to keep in mind, because in Pennsylvania and Delaware, internet sales are considered wholesale, even if the end customer is the general public. So you always want to be making sure to ask those questions and address that in your descriptions. Another thing to be mindful of is how payments are made. With the expansion of technology, we do see payments being made electronically. You could have somebody that all the payments are made in an app, all the payments are made online, all the payments are made by phone. There's no payments in person. If that's the case, that should be explained in the audit. That should all be being addressed. Addressing these simple things does help you make sure that you're classifying employees correctly, but also make sure that you're classifying the business correctly. Um, Another common thing in stores that hasn't been getting addressed is who's waiting on the customer, especially smaller stores, smaller businesses. If there's somebody that's maybe working in an office accepting payment, those are things that you want to note. Or if there's only one customer a month, that's also something you want to note. Giving those extra details helps explain your audit, and it helps justify what you did. And it also ensures that you're getting the right information to properly classify the business. Um, Another thing that you also want to observe when we're saying about where do employees work, we want to make sure that if employees are working in a warehouse, if they're working in a counter, if they're in the office and then go out of the office, those are all things that should be being addressed when you're looking at these issues with stores and cashiers. Just a reminder, when you are looking at cashiers, it is somebody that is accepting the payments for a good or a service. Um, it can be somebody that's accepting the payment in an office or at a counter. It is an in-person payment kind of system. So those are definitely things you want to make sure. You also want to make sure, especially with small businesses, that we are addressing who the cashier is. A lot of the times you look and it just talks about who's in the warehouse and who the owner is, and then there's no acknowledgement of how a payment is made and how a good is paid for. So that's just a key thing to keep an eye on. Clerical employees, this is a long-standing classification issue. I feel like this is something that's always going to be an issue. Every employer wants their staff to be considered clerical because it's a lower rated classification, especially when they're completing a mail audit. There seems to be this default for an employer to put clerical for anybody that's not physically doing the hands-on work. A lot of that goes to the employers not understanding the classification system, how to classify employees, the rules around clerical, and just this mindset of, well, they're not doing that. They're not out in the shop doing that, so they have to be the other classification. And that's where we come in as sort of the guardians of the rules here and make sure that everybody is following the rules properly. So the manual definition for clerical is that these are employees that are working in the office, they're doing paperwork, they're doing accounting, they're answering emails, answering phones, they're not waiting on customers, they're not directing the general public, they're not packing boxes, they're not physically out in the warehouse taking inventory and moving things around. These are just people that are in the office. If they are working in the office, you want to make sure that they're working entirely in the office. If they're working hybrid, which is something that has caught on since COVID, you want to notate how often they're working from home. If they are waiting on customers, you want to indicate that they are waiting on customers, how often, where they're accepting those payments. Just because the more information you get to justify and substantiate the way you're classifying, it's going to document your audit better. And then also, if they aren't waiting on the customers or if they aren't accepting payments, notating who is doing that work is also helpful to identify. Because if there is a difference in information, if you have more detailed information, it is helpful to help us make a determination. Another thing with clerical employees that we just want to clarify is that if somebody is running to the bank or to the post office as part of their duties, and that employee is just regularly in the office doing paperwork, doing accounting, and they might have to go and throw the invoices into the mailbox or run to the bank and put the checks in, that's still considered a clerical duty. That's part of the overall operations of the business. We don't consider that miscellaneous or governing class. We would get into governing class assignment if somebody was going to the store and picking up materials and then taking them to a job site, or they were going into the warehouse and picking up boxes and putting them in their car and dropping them off at the customer's location. Those are the kinds of things that you want to be mindful of. So if it's somebody that's just as a regular part of their duties goes to the bank, that doesn't take them out of clerical, because we have heard these responses, especially from employers, were like, oh, the auditor told me that anybody that steps foot out of the office isn't clerical anymore. And we just want to clarify that if you step foot out of the office, you can be clerical. You just have to be mindful of what they're actually doing when they step out of the office. It's not just a one and done the second you put your foot out the door. So just be mindful of that in dealing with clerical employees. Another touchy subject where we have noticed an increase in differences is with owner and officer inclusions and exclusions. These are dictated. This all primarily goes back to the Workers' Compensation Act. This comes from the Act. The Act dictates who is included and who is not included. And the manual fleshes out those rules about whether they need to be endorsed or not endorsed. So executive officers in Pennsylvania and Delaware, they are included by the Act. They can be excluded if they are endorsed on the policy listing their names. Conversely, sole proprietors, members, and partners in Pennsylvania, they're excluded by the Act, but they can voluntarily accept coverage and the policy can be endorsed. Again, the endorsement's added to the policy. It lists the names of the included individuals. There is wording within the manual that says that PCRB and DCRB are the repositories. This is where the policies are reported. And when the policy is issued and any endorsements are issued, those should be reported exactly as they were issued to PCRB within 30 days of issuance. That is where we refer to the policy documents here at PCRB. We pull up the policy as it was reported. When we're reviewing it for test audit purposes, we pull up your policy, we look at the endorsements. If the officers' names are listed as being included or excluded properly, we will go in, we will exclude those individuals from the audit per the policy documentation. One thing to keep in mind is that those endorsements do have to be properly submitted. Those are done electronically, and that's done normally through your policy reporting team. However, your policies get transmitted here to PCRB, DCRB. There are times where the endorsement does not list the names, and that does get a flag, and it tells the carrier that there's information missing. When we cite that in a difference, we normally will tell the carrier that this was already cited on the policy level and this needs to be corrected. It does need to be corrected before you write in to respond to the test audit difference, because when you write in, we're going to go back, we're going to pull the policy back up, we're going to go right to the endorsements, and we're going to verify that the endorsement is correct. If the endorsement isn't correct, we don't have a recourse to change the audit because we're going by the policy. The policy is a legal contract. So if the policy data is not correct, we do sustain the difference. So that is something, if you are starting to get a lot of these differences, that's something that I would talk to somebody in your underwriting team or your policy reporting team to make sure that they're aware that there is a flag for these, to make sure they're aware that the names need to be there and that these things are being reported properly. Because we do understand that these things are not a premium audit issue. These are an issue of policy data. So that's something that, while it is part of the audit, it's coming from the policy, not necessarily your audit. Your audit is just a tool that we use as part of the Test Audit Program to make sure that everything is correct. Because like Christina said, it is a quality program, and that quality program is a reflection of your entire policy from start to finish, which in the middle there, at some point, there's an audit somewhere between when the policy was issued and the statistical data came in. And that's where the Test Audit Program comes in. All right. Another issue that we have seen, and this one is a little baffling. We're not sure how this is starting to creep in, but we do want to make everyone aware of it. The policy specifies the contract date, the effective date, the inception date. That's the date that we should be auditing every policy to, the policy period. The Test Audit Program allows for a 16-day variance from that policy period, but that's not a manual rule. That's an exception within the Test Audit Program that allows for you to adjust to a policy as close as possible if the records aren't available to the policy period. Another thing to keep in mind is that when we're doing an audit, one of the very fundamental things in premium auditing is verifying to a secondary source. We do that to make sure that the payroll records are correct. And that secondary source is important, and we use that because, number one, it's hard to manipulate. Excuse me. And number two, that information is reported to the IRS and other governmental agencies who are in charge of basically making sure that that information is accurate. So in our mind, we do consider that to be a very good source. It is the source that generally does verify directly to the payroll records. Something that we've been seeing is where there's more payroll showing on the payroll report and then a giant adjustments being made to the verification. There have been cases where this has been hundreds of thousands of dollars being added to audits that's not being justified by any payroll report or verification or being explained. So if you do find yourself in a situation where you're off hundreds of thousands of dollars, you might want to go back to the employer and see if there's something missing from the report. Make sure you understand the report, that the dates are to the policy period, that the check dates are what are being used, that we're using the proper gross payroll figures. One of the things that we have found was that when an employer changes payroll companies and goes to a new company, sometimes there's a chunk of old payroll that's getting lumped into the new report. That's for an accounting purpose. However, it really wasn't part of the policy period that you're looking at. And at going back and asking the employer that question would have revealed the answer that there was a change and explained what happened. So you really do have to be cognizant of that. One of the things that we do tell our own field reps when they're doing an audit is always, if you're coming up with something that's not adding up, go back to the employer and make sure that you're understanding all those little codes and different items that are on the payroll report. Sometimes it's not as clear as it used to be, or sometimes the reports are very complicated or hundreds of pages. So we just have to be cognizant of that, and we can't just be adding giant amounts into our verification to balance the audit, because you're technically not verifying, you're just bulking up your number to make it balance to get the audit out and done. If you are in the case where you are making some sort of deviation, it needs to be explained. It should be documented in the audit somewhere. It could save us from sending a difference if you do have something in there that explains where you got those numbers, how you verified it, what you reviewed. It should be explained as thoroughly as possible if that's what's happening. So if you are the recipient of a difference, don't panic. It is just a suggestion at this point. That's our findings based on our independent review, the audit that we did. I do want to stress that what our field reps do is they obtain a payroll report, they obtain a description of the operations, they obtain job duties for each employee, they go over the owners and the officers. They do have a phone call with the employer if they're not on site, just to get all the information that they need. If your audit isn't documented and our audit is documented, we'll cite the difference so that you can come back and maybe you have something that you can give us to offer in response. But what we want you to do is use your original audit and your original notes and things like that, and try to explain your original audit. Give us supporting information that was part of your audit. If you have the payroll records, if we're saying there was a payroll difference, if we're saying that an employee does one job and we classify them one way, and your audit says that they do something else, go back to the employer and ask them, the bureau said you do this. This is what you really do. And if they come back and say, no, that's not what we do, this is what that person does, get that information in writing if possible. Give us an explanation. Maybe something did get confused. Maybe something got lost in the translation somewhere. And those are situations where if you go and you get that information and bring it back to us, we are able to revise the audit if there is something in there that's revisable. What we don't want you to do is just come back and say, well, this is what the employer said. Because we saw that in your audit and our audit said something different. So now we're giving you the chance to come back and support what you have. But be mindful, this isn't a chance to audit the test audit. It's not to go and rip apart the test audit and try to find other things and make comments about different things. We're really focusing on what we discovered to be the drivers of the difference and what we cited in that memo. And that's what you should focus your response on. And we don't want you to go back and do a whole nother survey or a whole nother review of the employer. You should be making your dispute based upon the information that you already had in your audit. And the thing about, if you do get a difference for differences about endorsements, make sure that the endorsement's updated before you respond. Some carriers will get some sort of verification or a screenshot showing that the endorsement was updated. If you provide us that gives you the assurance that you know it was corrected before you come back to us. That way you avoid the case where you think it was done and we go back and we check and it wasn't, because that also has happened. And again, that should all be done electronically. We don't want hard copy endorsements. So to help mitigate differences, one of the things you want to do is know when to request a classification review. Requesting a class review is really, really easy. It can be done on our website, pcrb.com. If you go under industry resources, there's a classification inquiry form there. That form asks for information about the employer. It asks for contact information for both you and the employer, and a description of what you're looking for in terms of the change. Essentially, you want to request a class change if you don't agree with the classifications that are being shown as authorized by PCRB, or if the description of operations that you obtained when you did your audit doesn't match the class that's being used or being authorized. So if there aren't authorized classes and you're using a class on your policy and you think that class is correct based on your description, you don't have to write in. But if the policy has a class that you don't agree with, you found out that they're doing something completely different, that's when you would write in and ask us to take a look at it. Another time you want to write in is if you're picking up uninsured subcontractors, particularly if they're doing something that isn't part of the employer's regular operations or the employer didn't have employees doing. Um, you would want to ask for an additional class in those situations. And when you submit your request, that comes into us electronically. It goes to our classification department. They'll review everything that you submitted. They'll determine whether or not a review is needed and whether to send a questionnaire or request a survey by our field operations department. Once they get all of the information, they issue a classification decision, and that will tell the carrier when the decision applies and what the rating value changes are so that the employer is also aware of the changes. One thing that I do want you to be mindful of is that if you request, oh, it's on the next screen. Sorry. So when you do request a classification review, you want to make sure that you're providing us a contact that's in Pennsylvania or Delaware, because we want to go to somebody that's knowledgeable about the operations being conducted here. We also ask that you give us the contact of somebody at the employer, not their accountant. We do understand that when you're getting the audit information, you're dealing with the accountant, but we want to go to the employer who knows their operations, what they do on a daily basis, as opposed to the accountant that's just getting their payroll and their business accounting information together for them. Like I did say, if your request involves subcontractors and you write in, you want to give us a copy of your audit worksheet showing that they're being picked up, and also tell us what they're doing so that we know what class you're looking for those subs. Um, Subcontractor approval classifications are done by the audit period. So if you find that somebody has a sub that they're using year after year, you may have to write in a few years in a row. If it is something that is habitual, you can ask that the classification department make the classification long term. However, you do have to show that it is something that you're picking up over and over again for that to happen. Um, Anytime you're submitting a request, you want to provide any documentation that you have to support it. If that's a letter from the employer or agent saying that something changed, if that's your audit report, if that's your loss control report, give us that information as a basis just so that we have something to go off of. And if there was a change in the operations, tell us when that change occurred and what changed so that we can focus our review. And the one thing for everybody in this group that is very great news is that if you notice that a class is wrong and you write in and you ask for that review prior to the test audit notification, we're not going to cite you a risk classification difference, but it has to be before test audit notification. And you have to basically understand that something's wrong there. So you telling us that there was something wrong prior to notification, we'll revise the audit. After the test audit is closed, we'll issue a classification decision advising the carrier of any changes that are needed. We cannot issue class changes during the test audit process. So sometimes if there is a test audit pending, it does delay the process a little bit between the time that you ask for a review and the time that that test audit closes. Okay. I am going to turn it over to our communications and marketing manager, Joe, for the questions. However, before we do that, I just wanted to make sure that I made you aware of some resources that we have out there. We do have our test audit bulletins, which are found under the test audit portion of our website. We also have the test audit portal guidebook, which is useful for anybody that does the uploads of submissions and difference responses and also the rescind submissions. We also have our test audit program guidebook. That is essentially the soup to nuts rules of the program, the selection process, and all of the ins and outs, also the appeals and all of that. Another reference that we always direct carriers to are the Pennsylvania and Delaware basic manuals. That is where all the rules come from. That is the basis of what we do here at the Bureau and the test audit program as a whole. If you have any questions that are audit related, you can always email me or Christina. And if you have class questions, we also have a whole entire classification staff that you can always call and ask a question about a scope or anything about a classification issue or concern, or if you're just not sure if something applies. So I am going to stop sharing, and I'm going to turn it over to our communications and marketing manager, Joe, for Q&A.
Thank you, Roxanne, for that presentation. And please don't go too far, as we'll need you to answer some of these questions. And thank you, everybody, for attending and for bearing with us during the teams being teams, it seems like. But let's get to these questions since we have a number of them. Christina and Roxanne will help provide answers. First up, Charles asks, what verification source reports do you request during your audit? What verification source reports are going to be requested during the audits?
We generally request the UC2s in Pennsylvania or the UC8s in Delaware. Those are the unemployment returns. That helps differentiate between the federal payroll and the breakdown between the states. A lot of carriers do the 941s. However, if there are state-specific employees, using the unemployment is a better source.
Thank you, Roxanne. From Wendy, this question comes, are your field representatives completing physical or virtual audits? If both, is there a certain criteria that's being used to determine which method will be utilized?
I'll take this one, Joe. We are hybrid is what we're calling it. We have some virtual and we do have some in person. All of our field reps make their own schedules. So technically all of them could be in person depending upon their location and what they're doing. But we do ask that for more complicated audits, particularly things maybe like manufacturing or larger payroll audits. We do try to do those in person. For other audits, I always use, and most people here are probably sick of me using this example, but I'm going to use it anyway. If an insured is a franchised McDonald's, a McDonald's is a McDonald's. There's really no reason for anybody to go out there and actually look at the McDonald's. So for businesses like that, we tend to say that they can be all virtual. So while there's not, a specific criteria we use, it is fluid, but we are doing both.
Christina, thank you. Karen has a question here. If an owner gave us job duties in writing to begin with, something that we wouldn't want, is that what we're saying? Looking for some clarification around an owner giving us job duties in writing at the start. And looking for clarification, do they want to return to the owner that information and confirm what they gave in the first place?
I'll take this one too, then Roxanne will give you a break. You should give us everything you have on your audit at selection. Don't wait for the difference. Don't wait for us to come back. So if you already have something in writing, whether it's an email that shows that, you were questioning the classifications during your review process and you went back to the insured and got an email and got clarification, which shows why you use something on your audit, it's better to provide it to begin with. As Roxanne mentioned, we want to, not send out differences if we don't need to. So if you can support your audit at the beginning, then it may mitigate a difference in the end.
Thank you, Christina. Going to keep moving because we have a number of questions to get to. This is from Nancy. What is the turnaround time for classification review inquiries?
I can do that one. A classifier has 30 days to respond to the initial request once it comes in. If they send a questionnaire to the employer, it's dependent upon the employer sending it back. They do follow up at an interval of 30 and 45 days, I believe, or 30 and 60 days, just to get the information. And at the third time, they will come back to you. For test audits, it's harder to say what the exact turnaround time is because it is dependent upon the test audit review being completed. However, once you submit a request, you generally will have 30 days before you hear anything from us at all before we start the review. So I guess a good rule of thumb would be somewhere from 3 to 6 months for a general class review from start to finish, I believe.
Very good. Thank you, Roxanne. Next question comes from Suzanne. Is there an opportunity for the carrier to submit updated electronic policy information prior to the test audit documentation due date, especially if it's found that an officer exclusion endorsement was not properly submitted originally?
Yes. So if in the course of your general audit review, you found that the endorsement wasn't properly submitted, absolutely go in and submit it. Make sure it's corrected. And that could even be done up until the point where you respond to the difference. So at any point between it being selected and you responding to a difference, if one's cited, it can be corrected.
Great, thank you. Pamela has a question. Can you add a class if it is a new exposure in the state without doing a classification authorization?
If there are not authorized classifications, you can add the classification that you feel is applicable. If there are authorized classifications, you have to write in and ask for a review.
Thank you. Emma has two questions here. What are the penalties for differences, if any, and where can we access the ANC rescind form that was mentioned earlier? Is there a link for that?
I got it, Roxanne. So the differences for penalties, if you go into the Test Audit Program guidebook available on the website, individual differences aren't necessarily going to cause any kind of penalty. It's once they're collective. Our standard for the program is 20%. So if you are below 20%, so that's 19.999, then you've passed the program for that particular quarter. If you're at 20% or above, there is an incentive schedule in the Test Audit Program, which explains it, but just a high level overview is it's basically the number of differences corresponding to a value based on what your difference percentage is that develops a fine. And that is done on a rolling 4-quarter basis. So whatever your cumulative numbers are is what will dictate the difference incentive charges. As far as the ANC form, it's on the portal. It's one of the drop-down requests. I think that's what you're asking for. So when you go in and it says type of audit, you'll have, independent physical, rescind, voluntary. One of those options will be audit noncompliance.
Thank you, Christina. Keep moving. Thank you for all the questions. By the way, Mary is asking if we find an uninsured sub that requires an additional class and we submit a classification review, will you authorize that class for just the expired or audited period?
Yes, we will authorize it for the audited period only for the uninsured subs being picked up.
Thank you, Roxanne. Colleen asks, does that mean we can use an incorrect class code at audit if it's not authorized, as long as we have requested the correct class code? Or do we have to wait for a response from the Bureau about the unauthorized class code before completing the audit?
Okay, so per manual rules, you have to use the classes that are authorized. So you would technically use the class that you know is not correct, write in and wait for us to respond. And we'll tell you whether you need to go back and revise that audit to use the new classification or whether it needs to be postponed. And we do understand that it is like mentally, you don't want to use the wrong class. So we understand as auditors that that is a touchy thing, but that is the manual rule.
Thank you. Kathy has a question about the definition of executive officers as it relates to the exclusion or subject to minimum max. Some insureds will have a VP of sales that is not an owner, shareholder, or a corporate officer, but insured refers to them as an executive officer. These officers would not be able to be excluded nor subject to the min-max, correct?
They would not be able to be excluded if they didn't have ownership, but if they are executive officers, and this goes back to the corporate minutes or bylaws, the bylaws might say anybody with the title of VP of sales is an executive officer. If they are truly an executive officer, the min-max would apply. However, they would not be subject to exclusion.
Thank you, Roxanne. Also, I've seen on a few audits recently pay for maternity or paternity leave. There is nothing that I could find in the manuals addressing this. Would those wages be included for maternity or paternity leave?
Yes, they would be included.
Thank you. Mary
That would be
has
like sick time.
comparable to sick time. Mary has a question. Please explain the process of requesting a class code authorization and test audit. Did you say that we could submit a class code authorization after an audit has been selected for test audit and still avoid incurring a test audit difference?
It has to be before the test audit notification. So say we're dealing March 1st is coming up. So March 1st elections, if you submitted something today for something that's selected on March 1st that you get the notification about, we wouldn't cite a difference. However, if in the middle of next week on the 3rd you submitted it, we would submit a difference or cite a difference if we've seen it. So you do have to get it in before the test audit notification.
Thank you. Here's a question from Susan about a specific case. Why are clerical employees in a township that are collecting water and sewer bills considered cashiers and put into a higher class?
They're not always, and I think the next question actually deals with this. So it is a regular and frequent type of review. So I think we would look at, are all township citizens coming in on a regular basis to pay their water bill? How often, how many days a week? Is it once a month? Is it just one person doing it? You need a whole bunch of other information before you can finally decide on what that classification should be. There's not just one definite, they took one payment. I think Roxanne talked about this before about, if they're running to the bank, it doesn't take them out of clerical. Taking one payment because, there's one person left in the district who refuses to use the online payment system, then you're not going to put them in the higher rated class. But, if everyone in the township is coming in and paying their bills or their tickets or whatever it may be. So you'd need to explain and provide detail on why you're assigning the class that you're assigning.
Thank you, Christina. We have about 7 minutes left before the top of the hour and just a few questions left. So thank you everyone for hanging in as we get to all these. This from Catherine, does correcting an owner officer inclusion exclusion revise the test audit findings? Revise in quotes.
Yeah, I'll take it. No, in that as long as you recognized it, prior to a difference being cited or even after that point. If it's a recognition, you're not actually changing a class code. If your audit is excluding officers because you have a document that says they're excluded and then you discover that maybe it wasn't filed with the Bureau and you're simply doing that electronic filing to make sure that everything matches, no. But if your audit says that they're excluded and there's nothing online and you don't change that until after we cite the difference will still be cited.
Thank you, Christina. Where do we find, this is from Mary, where do we find the classification, authorized classes for a risk? And also where do we find classification reviews that have been done by the Bureau?
So we do not post the classification reviews because that information is privileged. We don't want something that explains how an employer operates being made available to everyone in the public. So that is protected. It is available to the carrier of record and the employer. Authorized classes are listed on our website under the application login under view authorized classes. You do have to have a username and password, but that is a free site. If you have access to the Test Audit portal, generally, I think you do have access to the view authorized classes.
Thank you, Roxanne. Andrea asks, how do you handle class codes at audit that are not authorized by PCRB, DCRB in the cases of employees working in PA or Delaware when there was previously no exposure? Example being a newly hired salesperson when the main business is elsewhere.
You mentioned this already, so do you want to reiterate?
If it's something that's being added and there are not authorized classes, you add whatever classification you feel. However, if there are authorized classes, you have to write in to add a different classification, even if it's a new operation.
Recording will be available afterwards, either later today or first thing tomorrow. Here's a question from Nicolette. Is there somewhere to look up bulletin numbers?
Yep, on the Bureau website, pcrb.com. If you go into the Test Audit tab, There's a whole bunch of information there, and the test audit bulletins are there, and they're currently listed by number. If it's something specific to, for example, how to change a contact, the title will be there. Otherwise, the title of it will just be an appeal. If we had an appeal recently, it'll be how we handled it and what the outcome was. But you can reach them there. There's 129 there currently, I believe, of all shapes and sizes. They go back to like 1982 or something. So.
Thank you. How do we confirm if an exclusion or inclusion endorsement has been properly submitted?
The way we see that is looking at PDM. I'm pretty sure that carriers are able to look at that, but you can also look at the transactions that were submitted for the policy.
Thank you. Couple more, if we can sneak these in. If Nathan's asking if the Bureau's audit contact when the insured differs from the carriers and there are inconsistent explanations from the insured between these different contacts, could this ever be something the carrier notes in a difference response for leniency?
You can note that information. However, if the information in our audit is accurate, we're going to sustain the information that we have. You would have to prove that the information that we have is not accurate because of that contact.
Thank you. I think this is a question we've already answered, but how can the carrier on a record obtain a class review report? I think you just shared that, Roxanne. Could you mention that again?
The class review report, you can reach out to our classification department if you're the carrier of record and ask for a copy of a review that's been performed. I would caution if something's old, we tend not to release those because the information can change and it may not be useful. However, if there is something recent, we will provide it if it's helpful to you.
Great. Thank you for that, Roxana. Thank you for those questions again, all very helpful. And we'll be able to share this video and this Q&A session with everybody on the call in a short order within the next 24 hours or so. I see one more question coming in from Rick. Might be able to sneak this in. If a subcontractor has, oh, go ahead.
So I'm sorry, it was the one before that, I believe. If there's a difference on an audit performed by a vendor, is the carrier ultimately responsible? Yes. Ultimately, you're going to submit that data to us. So, and your name's on the product, so you are responsible. And on that one, if a subcontractor has coverage, they choose to exclude themselves from coverage. Yeah, I'm not sure, Roxanne. Maybe I'm not reading it right. If a subcontractor has coverage, but they choose to exclude themselves from coverage to said fall under the insured's coverage. That's more of a legal question. Yeah, the Bureau wouldn't make that determination. You ultimately, as the carrier, would make that determination, and we would only get involved with what payroll would be included and what class would be assigned.
Thank you. And then Justin's asking there about the attaching emails regarding ops class, job duties between the insured and auditor to the audit report. Is that helpful to attach?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Excellent. Excellent. Folks, we will have this recording out to you shortly. And again, just want to thank you all for your participation and your time today. And we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Please stay connected and contact Christina or Roxanne with any direct questions. Take care.
Curious, contact us with your questions.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.